Whether your messy first draft is 50,000 words or 250,000 words, turning that into a cohesive story is a bit of a daunting task. But the developmental edit is such a crucial stage that it can really make or break your book. So, in developmental editing, we are looking to fix large scale issues with the story, such as things concerning plot holes, character development, and overall structural issues. There's a lot to consider in terms of what to change and how, especially if you're unsure where to start. Here's a breakdown of my basic developmental editing process, as well as some tips that I have found not only make the process easier to digest, but also speed it along. Every writer has their own editing process, and every book has its individual editing needs. So, while most books probably don't need edits in all of these areas, this is just what I like to assess when I'm planning my edits. Typically, I want to focus on the large scale concepts that pull through from the beginning all the way to the end of the book. Overall, at this stage, I want to make sure the story is cohesive. So, I do this by straightening out anything that's confusing and tying up the loose ends. So, when it comes to characters, I'm looking mainly at the character development. So, I want to make sure this is moving in the right direction and changing as I intended from chapter to chapter. Do the subtle shifts in the character's mindset throughout the story ultimately lead to their big breakthrough at the end of the story? And is this done in a way that the readers can follow? Are the characters all well rounded and written believably? Do they have their distinct voices? Do they all have growth, motivations, and goals? And if the story is told through multiple point of views, I really want to make sure that each scene or chapter is told through the right character's perspective. So is it told through the eyes of the character who the events of that particular scene or chapter have the most impact on? Are the characters' choices and reactions to things believable and consistent with their personalities? And do these emotional changes resonate with the reader? In the same vein, do your themes come through as intended? Just making sure that the themes didn't get lost or buried underneath new interesting ideas or chapters that didn't quite pan out the way you were thinking. And the themes themselves, are they well balanced? Are they meaningful and impactful to the story and characters, without being too heavy handed that the reader is distracted by them? Speaking of story, this is the largest area of focus for developmental edits. Personally, what I focus on most is how the story works together as a whole. As you're drafting, you're typically kind of looking at the story chapter by chapter or scene by scene, but it's really helpful to kind of take a step back after finishing the draft and look at it again, almost as if you're outlining it. So, does each chapter have good momentum, and does the story move forward in some meaningful way in every single scene or chapter? Of course, not every scene needs to have a major plot twist, but each scene or chapter should contribute to either the character development, the plot, or the theme in some meaningful way. If not, it might need heavier edits or to be scrapped altogether. So, if you're looking at the story from kind of a bird's eye view, does it have a good flow overall? So, are questions brought up and then answered throughout the story in a way that is engaging to the readers? Are the highs and lows of the story, the characters' high moments and low moments, in good balance with each other? And are they in accordance to the book's overall tone? Do the characters' successes and failures have a good rhythm throughout the story? Smaller story arcs within a novel, sometimes called sequences, take place over a handful of chapters. So, do those as sort of contained stories have good momentum as well? Are the characters resolving issues and conflicts and moving through the story in a way that raises the stakes for the main overarching plot? Does each big question that's answered either bring up more questions, drive the story forward, or somehow raise the stakes for the story as a whole? A story with poor pacing can either really quickly lose momentum or give the readers whiplash, and even the most important scenes can lose their impact. So consider if any sections of the story drag on and don't make much progress, or if there are areas that are lacking a lot of detail. A lot of the times, I end up needing to expand on action or fight scenes, as well as scenes or chapters where the characters kind of react to or reflect on some of the more recent plot twists. Consider if there are any areas where elements such as world building or characters' backstories are not contributing to the plot or character development. Sometimes I add these kind of elements intending to use them one way, but through drafting they become obsolete and therefore need to be removed. And does each chapter have a good structure? Does it have a good balance of action, dialogue, and exposition to keep the reader engaged? And of course, the other big element in developmental editing is making sure that you have consistency across the book. Are all of the world building rules and logic consistent throughout the story? And are there any unintended discrepancies with things like backstories, locations, timelines, or events? Knowing what to look for is a huge part of getting your developmental edit in place, but so is having a good strategy for actually identifying issues. It can be tricky to shift from the chapter by chapter mindset that's needed for drafting into more of a bird's eye view mindset of looking at the story for developmental editing. So, for me, keeping my outline up to date is a huge part of my developmental editing process. I personally like to organize by scene and not by chapter. And I just like to have about a 3 sentence description of all the most important elements of a scene. So these are going to be things like big turning points in the plot, character development moments, or clues that they found if they're trying to solve some kind of problem. This is also a great time to create a definitive story Bible if you don't have one already. This is a document detailing important information to things like the characters and world building. So you might have the basic descriptions of your characters. Say you can't remember if this one side character has green eyes or blue eyes, you have a place that you know is the correct information, and you don't have to go searching through your draft for it. If you've recently finished your draft and you have a really good idea on your story's main issues, you can probably jump right into planning and then editing. But sometimes a full or partial reread makes all the difference when it comes to planning your edits. I like to go through each scene and make notes for my planned changes, and I do this for both line editing and developmental editing at the same time. So if I'm looking at a scene and I know I need to change a choice that the character makes for the developmental edit, but I also notice there's a section that could be rewritten better, I will note that as well for my next round of editing, which is the line edit. This is a huge time saver when it comes to editing. Sometimes through multiple rounds of editing, it can become unclear where the issues are in your story. So if you note them early, then you can reference your own notes and actually see things for what they are. When it comes to critique partners or writing groups, I personally do my developmental edit before anybody else reads my story. But of course, your process may be different. If you know there are major things that you want to change with the story, this probably makes sense for you. But if you're not sure what needs improvement, or you're really confident that the story doesn't need much improvement, you might get more out of critique partners and writing groups by sending the story to them earlier in the process. Before making major changes to a story, I like to have a plan and write it down. This makes it 1, easier to stay on track, and 2, easier to track my progress. Sometimes during the developmental edit, it can be tempting to make changes to smaller details of the story. I might be editing something for consistency, but then notice a few paragraphs that could be rewritten better. Working on this at this stage will typically slow down my progress. I don't want to be worrying about small details when there are still large overarching issues that need to be addressed in the story. I find it really helpful to keep a list of needed changes, like I said, and stick to making only those changes during the developmental edit. So don't worry too much about your prose at this stage. During developmental editing, the phrases, "it doesn't have to be pretty," and "it's gonna get worse before it can get better," are kind of the mantra. Not to say that I'm trying to write poorly during the developmental edit, but it just keeps you out of that line editing mentality where you're worrying about exactly where the comma should go. And I'm always curious to know how many different rounds of editing most writers do on a typical novel, so drop me a comment down below. And if you like fantasy adventure novels with sarcasm and monster hunting, you should check out Revenge of the Druid Queen, which is my most recently published book. Alright, that's all I got for you, so thanks for watching. Bye!